Welcome to the Alchemy of Success podcast with Dr. Michael Leslie, PhD, designed to inspire, educate, and empower listeners to embrace a life of abundance in all areas: mind, body, spirit, relationships, and finances. Let's get started.
Hi, good evening. I'm Michael Leslie, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our fifth in a series of podcasts on the alchemy of success. This podcast is all about giving you the tools you'll need so that you can get away from your 9 to 5 and create the life of your dreams. And each week we feature a different speaker who has an expertise that you can apply to building your business, to transforming your health, or simply to expanding your awareness of what's possible for you in your life. Tonight, we have the pleasure of having Paul Deitch, who is an internet strategist specifically focused on LinkedIn, how to make the best use of that tool in order to bring yourself before people and monetize yourself as you do it. So, without more to do, I'll have you listen to a brief introduction to Paul Deitch. Paul is an outlier who was born and raised in Hawaii by his grandparents. He spent the majority of his professional career in the finance industry until he pivoted to LinkedIn training and strategizing. 3 years ago, Paul didn't have much of an online presence, but now he has 5,000 plus global followers on LinkedIn and has created his own podcast called Impossible Equals I'm Possible. Paul takes a unique hands-on approach to serving his clients. His mission is to help you unlock your brilliance, stop being your own best-kept secret, and monetize your story.
Michael, thank you so much for having me. What a wonderful introduction. So grateful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming, Paul. So, Paul, I'm going to start by asking you some what might appear or might seem to be very personal questions, but I really want people to know who you are and what you bring to the table as people attempt to build a new life for themselves and use LinkedIn as a tool for doing that. I think most people will be curious about, what a guy from Hawaii, what's his experiences like when he comes to the mainland. And also maybe you could tell us something about what it's like not only to come to the mainland, but to have grown up with your grandparents.
Yeah, what a great question. So when I moved from Hawaii to Florida in March of 2022, so we're going on 3 years, going on 4 years. Wait, 22. Yeah, going on. This is going to be my fourth year in Florida. That was kind of the icebreaker question that I would always get asked when I would go to events or anything. They're just like, "Wow, you were born and raised in Hawaii. Why would you ever leave?" And I think what what happened is just that it's such a small place, and one of the biggest things that I realized is that I was always different, and part of that was like you were saying, like I grew up with my grandparents, and what I kind of just realized is that while a lot of people have such a hard time with change, for me, it was kind of the constant that I've known throughout my life. Like I always like to say that my life has kind of been a tale of two halves. The first half, because I grew up with my grandparents, I wasn't exposed to social media and all these different tech gadgets until I was a teenager. So it's kind of given me a unique perspective, and I like to say kind of the best of both worlds, which we'll dive into later about how that's become a huge part of why I've been able to do the work that I've been doing throughout my professional career. And I would say the biggest difference between Hawaii and the mainland, as they call it, is it's obviously just bigger. There's more opportunity, but Hawaii was very diverse as well. The best way that I can kind of explain it is how COVID has kind of affected the world where you have people like living all over. That's kind of how Hawaii always was, because it was a major travel destination. So ever since I was little, I was exposed and met people from all over the world. So it's been an incredible accelerator for me to kind of just, where a lot of people were adjusting, when I actually go back and think about it, I've kind of been in that type of environment my entire life, and it's a huge advantage for sure.
What I've heard is that the diversity of Hawaii gave you a perspective that one might not have if one were a mainlander and growing up perfect in a particular state, for example, in our country, where maybe you don't have the worldwide exposure that you would have from tourism in Hawaii. Maybe you would if you lived in Florida because of Orlando and Disney and all of that stuff. But it's like being at. I would imagine it would be like being at a place that's permanently a vacation spot. So, with that in mind, I'm wondering what are the specific aspects of growing up with your parents that make you different from people who maybe grew up with with your grandparents, that differentiate you from people who maybe grew up with their parents?
Yeah, what a great question. I always say that my grandparents were the greatest cheat code that I could have ever been given, and the biggest difference that I would say is, as I look at my generation now, and I see like a lot of the characteristics and the way that they view the world, the the biggest thing that I've noticed is that a lot of the old school values that were kind of embedded in me when I was younger are kind of fading now, in the sense of like work ethic, respect. A lot of people in my generation are very entitled. So I just think that my grandparents really taught me a lot of things that I didn't realize at the time were going to be incredible accelerators and tools that would allow me to thrive when I entered the adult world as a teenager. I started going to college when I was 16. So in order to kind of be in that environment, it required a lot of maturing and things that a lot of people my age didn't necessarily possess. And a big part of all of it was due to my grandparents, for sure.
Great. So you mentioned in a previous conversation that we had that that kind of background, and you said growing up perhaps with more mature people. I think parents can be very immature because we're doing this stuff for the first time, right? Raising children, so we might not know exactly what to do. A grandparent might have more experience in that. But you mentioned in your conversation that that empowers you to be able to teach people of a certain age how to use the new technology and able to communicate more effectively. And what is it about that experience that you think helps you understand people my generation who are, and I could be your grandparent for that matter, but I'm thinking of a demographic that's, a little older who are wanting to learn how to use these tools, but perhaps sometimes find themselves frustrated because they just can't get it fast enough, or we don't think we're getting it fast enough, or we don't think we're doing it right, or simply we're not doing it right because we don't have the proximity to the experience with technology that perhaps you grew up with or that your generation grew up with. So, what is it that you can help us with in terms of becoming more adept at using technology such as LinkedIn to grow our presence online?
Yeah, I would say a great question. I would say the biggest thing, and I was actually thinking about this today as I was creating content. One of the biggest mistakes that I feel people make, like across, it's a generational thing, is that more often than not, people are always focused on what they don't have versus what they do have. And the reason why I share that is because when I look at my own personal experience, I entered the adult world when I was 16, supported my family financially in Hawaii since I was 17 up until I moved to Florida when I was 25. And I've been the youngest person in, I'd say, like 95% of professional rooms that I've been a part of. Over the past 3 years, I've trained with elite mentors in business and finance and some of the top people in the world. And I was the only one in my generation in those rooms. And when I look at a lot of the feedback that I get from people, right? Like they think, oh, I'm too old or I don't know how to do this. My my grandpa shared something with me when I was younger that really has kind of been one of the most profound things that I've learned. And I was a scholar growing up, so I was always like book smart, reading and all these different things. But I didn't have a lot of life experience. And he always told me that experience will always be your greatest teacher in life. And the reason why I share that is what I lacked for in experience, I was able to make up for in work ethic or learning like how to research. And the way that this applies to that older demographic is maybe you don't have the technical expertise, right? Like you don't know how to use the technology, but you have the professional experience and expertise because you've done your career for decades. A lot of them have in that case, and they've created systems. And I would say where LinkedIn differs than any other social media platform is that on LinkedIn, the name of the game is really about substance and sustainability, whereas on all the other platforms, people are just trying to go viral, and you're focused on, like, you see a lot of vanity content. Whereas when you come on LinkedIn, people are pretty familiar with a lot of things. They're a lot more, I'd say, intelligent in the sense of a lot of people on LinkedIn are usually like making more money, right? So they're more like adept to research and knowing like what to do. So the fact that you have decades of experience, that's a huge advantage over somebody who may have the social media part. And the other thing that I would say too is oftentimes a lot of people think that just because they don't know anything that they have to start from the bottom. That was probably one of the biggest mistakes that I made on LinkedIn, was that I built my network from scratch after I moved from Hawaii to Florida in March of 2022. I didn't know anybody professionally. So I kind of started over. I didn't have a LinkedIn profile until I signed up for my first program. So I joke with a lot of my clients, like, the fact that you have a profile on LinkedIn and you have like a presence there, essentially, kind of somewhat, you're already so far ahead of where I was. And I think for a lot of people, the biggest thing is direction, right? Because so many times people are focusing on action and doing. But I was very fortunate to have a mentor, and he shared with me that you can take all the action you want, but if you're taking action in the wrong direction, you're not ever going to get to where you want to go. And that's always the place that I would suggest people start on the beginning is when it comes to your presence on LinkedIn, think about like those three basic questions that a lot of people think are so simple, but if you actually sit down and answer those questions, and they're so interconnected in the sense of figuring out like who are you at your core, right? What do you stand for? Then usually once you figure that out, you're able to create what it is that you want. And then once you know who you are and what you want, then you're usually able to figure out like why that's so important. I feel like a lot of people approach it backwards, from the sense of starting, you can't really start with why if you don't understand like who you are. And that's been the biggest challenge that I see for a lot of people. And Michael, you and I were kind of talking about this before, how when, especially when people are transitioning, right, whether it's like a new chapter of your life or you're leaving behind a corporate career to become an entrepreneur, there's that huge sense of identity challenge, right, where it's like I was used to doing one thing for so long, people don't really know like who they are or where they want to go in their new role, because people tie their identity to what they do, and who you are and what you do are two completely different things. And that's kind of some of the things that I would share for people who are looking to start building a presence on LinkedIn.
let's talk a little bit about that distinction that you've made between who you are and what you do. And I remember when you and I also spoke earlier that you said that many people in my generation have been using LinkedIn or even use it today as a place to post pretty much a resume, right? A resume, an online resume. This is where I work, how many years I worked there, this is what my responsibilities were, these are some of the accomplishments I had while I was there. And you mentioned that is not really what LinkedIn is currently uh, set for thriving at. That there were aspects of what one wanted to or needed to communicate to the world that would distinguish them from what they've accomplished. Can you talk to us more about what that might be that we need to do distinctly on LinkedIn that perhaps many of us have not been doing?
I feel like it really comes down to a basic life principle. And I mean, the most prevalent one I would say is in relationships. But one of the biggest things that I learned is that a lot of times people look at things for what they were or what they want it to be versus what they are. And with LinkedIn specifically, a lot of people are getting caught up on kind of what it was. One of the biggest reasons why I came to LinkedIn is I actually, when I became an entrepreneur in 2022, I was a first generation entrepreneur. So I didn't have like, a family member. It was kind of like learning on the fly pretty much. And for the first 6 months, I was building on Facebook and Instagram. And one of the things that I was kind of annoyed with was the whole vanity part, right? Like you'd get people who were putting up like a front because they wanted you to see like how they wanted their life to be, and then obviously with the work that I did in my finance career, I would need to know all the information, and then I would find out that the truth was completely opposite from the picture that people were portraying on social media. And that was one of the biggest things on LinkedIn. When I hop on conversations with people, the question that's been pretty universal across the board is I'll always ask people like, "Can I ask you a question?" And they'll always say, "Yeah, like, absolutely." And I always ask them like, there's such a huge disconnect between the person that I'm having a conversation with and the person that they're portraying on their LinkedIn profile. And the more that I kind of dive into that, usually what the case has always been is that it's usually someone close to them, whether it's a coach, a mentor, a spouse, a family member, that people have this idea of they need to show up how they want people to see them versus showing up as who you actually are. And I think that's what makes LinkedIn very powerful in that perspective, is that it really allows people to learn about the person behind the profile. And when I look at like the name LinkedIn in general, right? Like the purpose of LinkedIn was to like, connect, right? It's in the word of the name of the platform, LinkedIn. And over time, I feel like a lot of people have kind of lost sight that connection is built personally before professionally. And if you look at, your experience on LinkedIn, I'm sure, right? Like you're getting a lot of pitch slapping. You're getting like a lot of people who are just from the get go, they're trying to do business, but it's like, I don't even know who these people are. And that's been a huge challenge, I think, for a lot of people, is they're so used to showing up as like there's kind of a divide, right? Like when you're in the corporate world, like you have one image, and then when you're not at work, you're like a completely different person. So people kind of feel that, oh, I'm kind of like in between, when really LinkedIn, I like to say, is about incorporating your personal life into your professional life. And that's been a huge, I would say, shift in the platform over the past 3 years that I've been on it. You're starting to see more vulnerability and storytelling because people are realizing that that's how you build like trust, credibility, when you can connect with people and share those things that a lot of people are probably going through, but they don't have the courage to share, that has been a huge tool on, as I like to say, like winning on LinkedIn and growing your network and getting people to work with you and all these different things. It all starts with connecting on the human level before ever offering anything on a professional level.
I believe what you're suggesting and what you're inviting us to do is a radically different approach than what I can say for sure people of my generation thought they should do in order to use a colloquial phrase, to get over, to be successful. And so I'm really fascinated by how you are able to demonstrate that the authenticity approach to communicating and being with other people in your life, especially in your business life, is much more successful, if you would, than what we've been taught to do, which is, as you said, is to hide or to present or to maybe even some cases falsify who we are so we can attract, what we think we're attracting, business, or we're attracting the kind of attention we want from other people. So talk to us a little bit about the role of authenticity in being able to not only communicate effectively, but also to be able to attract the kind of business.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I always joke, right? Like I got so tired of the word authentic because it kind of became such a buzzword. And in my experience on LinkedIn, I personally found that a lot of people who led with that, there was a huge distinction between the person that they portrayed publicly versus the person that I would meet behind the scenes. So one of the things that I started realizing is that when you are authenticity is something that you shouldn't have to tell people. It's something that they should be able to feel, right? Like when you're having a conversation with somebody, when you're meeting them, I shouldn't have to tell you that I'm authentic. It's kind of like I have the same aspect on why I don't use the word like expert or guru or any of these phrases that people use, because over the past 3 years, I've had the privilege of training with people who are considered, the best in their industry. And the biggest thing that I noticed is not one of them ever used the word guru, expert, and all these different things. And there's a great quote from a legendary running back, Walter Payton, and he said, "When you are good, you'll tell everyone, and when you're great, they'll tell you." And I would say the biggest shift that I've made on the way that I approach social media and content and all these different things is that when I started working with clients on my first last year was my first year in the professional training and coaching space, because majority of my professional career prior I was in the finance industry. And I learned that most people in the professional training and coaching space are really just teaching people how to be like them. When going back to what we shared earlier, for me, it's about teaching people how to unlock their brilliance, because in in a world where we'll just use coaching as an example, right? There's millions of coaches. The one thing that's going to separate you from any other person are your unique perspectives and insights and strategies and all these different things. Yet oftentimes so many people will silence themselves and they'll look to somebody else, when really the uniqueness that you have and your perspective and your mind and all these different things, that's the greatest asset that you have. So for me, it's been really helping people to kind of unlock that. And one of the things that my mentor told me, which was so powerful, she said, if you're really thinking about it, like coaching and mentorship is really about teaching people how to trust and think for themselves, because a lot of times we know the answer to the questions that we're asking, right? It's just like we want to check with somebody who's more qualified, if you will, or they can validate that I'm right. So that's what I would say from a content perspective. A lot of people look at it from this perspective of, oh, I need to create more, more, more. And I think just speaking primarily from living in the US, we have this idea that it's always like more, 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 right? Like, oh, we need to do more. We need to create more content. We need to do more videos. I'll tell you, Michael, I had a really eye-opening experience when I started serving a lot of my clients last year with content strategy specifically. And a lot of these people had invested thousands of dollars with other people, and I was kind of looking at their content strategy. And while I like to say that the name of the game on LinkedIn is really about people, you do need to understand the technical aspects of the platform. And a lot of people didn't realize that they were kind of shooting themselves in the foot. But when I told them that, hey, let's try and dial this back and focus on creating quality content versus quantity. And LinkedIn, from a technical standpoint, has even switched the way that their kind of algorithm has worked, where before the first couple hours would determine the performance of your content, whereas now when your posts are sitting like 2 to 3 days, the boost that you would get from like a ton of reactions in the first couple hours, you're now getting then. But that was really something that I learned recently because, and Michael, I'm sure you've had this experience where you have an idea, right? And you tell somebody something and you're like, oh, it works. But deep down, you really don't know kind of like why it works. And that was kind of what happened to me as I was sharing all these things with my clients. And because I was doing audio events on LinkedIn and I was posting like multiple times a day, I wasn't following that rule. And then when I decided this year to kind of take a break from social media and zoom out to zoom in, as I like to say, I started realizing that I hadn't posted on LinkedIn for like a month, but I was still getting, my network was growing. I was getting tons of connections and followers reaching out to me. I was getting DMs. And it made me realize the one thing that I had kind of missed. And it was this idea that I think the biggest challenge is that we don't really give people time to process a lot of the things that we're saying. And what I learned is that especially if you're somebody who creates of substance, right, and you have things that are valuable and are actionable, and it takes people time to actually read it a couple times and sit with it and kind of digest. We were constantly hitting people with a new post, right? So it's like if I did a post that was like so insightful and it got great engagement and all these different things, instead of giving people time to actually like process that and you know figure out if they have any questions or whatever, I'm constantly hitting them with a new post, right? And that was the biggest thing that I realized, is that in this culture of more, 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 we don't ever really give people time to enjoy and get to experience our content in a way that I feel like insightful content really needs to be dealt with, right? Because people are just so overwhelmed. You got a million different things going on, and when you have posts flying from left and right and all these different things, not giving people the time to actually process it, I found was why that strategy actually worked. And the last thing that I'll say before I hand it back to you is that I want to invite everybody to think about content as a guide and just figuring out, how can I start more conversations? And I'll tell a really quick story. I have a very interesting relationship with TikTok, story for another time. But one of the things that I learned on TikTok is that all the content that I was experiencing on my feed or For You page, as they call it, was really about just starting conversations. And as much as I maybe didn't like or didn't agree with the conversation, that's really the first step to transformation and any type of change is we have to allow conversations for it. And for your generation, growing up with my grandparents, we didn't really talk about a lot of things. And that's why I feel like a lot of people in that older demographic, when you ask them to, hey, like, share your story, like, what are some experiences that you've had? A lot of times it's questions that people haven't been asked before, and they have no idea how to answer it. And that was a huge thing that you and I talked about in a previous conversation, is that I love that demographic because they are the most brilliant people that I have met in my life. And the biggest challenge that they have is communicating their experiences and expertise in this new modern world. Yet they don't realize that they have they have a greater asset to offer than the disadvantage of social media. And that's in many reasons why I believe that the older people are, the more social media is an advantage versus a disadvantage. So I'll hand it back to you.
To Paul Deitch, an internet and LinkedIn strategist who has a fresh approach to how we can be present to the people that we want to relate to and eventually sell to on LinkedIn. And I'm going to take a minute now to have you know a little bit more about Paul if you've arrived here recently. Paul is an outlier who was born and raised in Hawaii by his grandparents. He spent the majority of his professional career in the finance industry until he pivoted to LinkedIn training and strategizing. 3 years ago, Paul didn't have much of an online presence, but now he has 5,000 plus global followers on LinkedIn and has created his own podcast called Impossible Equals I'm Possible. Paul takes a unique, hands on approach to serving his clients. His mission is to help you unlock your brilliance, stop being your own best kept secret, and monetize your story. Okay, Paul, so I think about this time we can transition to talking about how you use your particular expertise to get someone who is, we're not going to use the word authentic, but who's being himself, right? He's presenting the person he actually or she actually is willing to do that, to present that to the public, how you help them use the technology of LinkedIn and the algorithms of LinkedIn to communicate with people in a way that is, I'm going to use that word authentic because I do like it, in a way in which people feel that they can trust the person they're speaking with and they would want to do business with them based on that trust they've established from actually getting to know them.
Yeah, Michael, great question. So I would say the place that you always want to start is with clarity. Like the biggest thing that I find is, I like to say, like, I'm happy to share this with people. Your Everything on LinkedIn begins and ends with your profile. And when I think about the purpose of the LinkedIn profile, it's essentially kind of like a billboard, right? Like it it gives you an opportunity to demonstrate and show people who you are, who you serve, what problems you solve, why you're on LinkedIn, and how you can actually help people. And there's really like 5 questions I would say that are so important to essentially kind of answer. And once you're able to figure that out and design your profile from that perspective, then a lot of other things kind of just fall into place. Like, what's so funny is I'll usually meet with people and they're like, okay, I have no idea to start. And I'll ask them these questions. And when they really think about their experience and some of the big lessons that they've learned, and um, all the things that maybe, and the thing that I always share with them that's so funny is the thing that you don't want to share is probably going to be the thing that changes your life, because there's vulnerability is such a game changer, especially on LinkedIn, especially in the time that we're in right now, where so many are battling, finding new employment and layoffs and financial challenges and all these different things. Like, you have no idea where people are or who you're going to impact with sharing your story. But going back to those 5 questions, the first question is, who are you? Right? I find that the biggest thing that a lot of people are looking for on LinkedIn is alignment. They want people who maybe they don't necessarily think the same. And I always like to say, I like being around like-hearted people, not like-minded people, because I want the alignment to be there from a spiritual perspective, where people have a lot of the same values. But I love when people have different takes than I do. It's kind of like, you like using the authentic word. Like, that's wonderful. Um, the second question is figuring out, who do you serve? The the biggest, I would say, and this is something like when I go back to my own personal experience, niching down on LinkedIn, I always looked at as such a negative. The way that it was always explained to me was coming from a restrictive place. So I never liked it, because my experience, I had helped pretty. You could have put anybody in front of me based off of my experience that I had in the finance world, and I would have known how to help them. So I didn't niche down for the longest time. However, when I started serving primarily the 50 plus age demographic, and the way that my headline is now, win on LinkedIn, building presence and profit for the 50 plus age demographic, I learned that niching down is really about targeting. And when you're designing your profile, it's important to understand what the viewers and what your ideal client is looking for. And the one question that they're basically trying to figure out is this person talking to me? When I made that switch, 90% of the connection requests, the DMs, the comments, the opportunities that I've gotten were in that 50 plus age demographic. And that's been like a huge part, is that a lot of people just don't have a target, right? And the next thing that I would say is, when I first started on LinkedIn, I was still in the finance space before I pivoted to LinkedIn training and strategy. Personalization was a huge game changer for me. I Let's see, I've been on LinkedIn. This is going on my third year. In the past like 2 years that I've been on LinkedIn, I've had over 500 coffee chats with people all over the world. So the fact that I've actually like built relationships with a lot of my connections has been invaluable. And the reason why I personalize things is because I used to always end my connection request with asking people like, hey, I would love to support you. How can I support you? That was always my final question. And, after doing this for hundreds of times, nobody ever answered that question. And in the beginning, I always thought that it was like, oh, it's a humble thing. People didn't want to ask. And then what I learned through just like deeper interactions and conversations with people is they didn't really know how to ask for help because they didn't know how other people could help them. So I think that's a big part as well. Like when you have people viewing your profile, let them know about how they can help you. You want to look at your profile and your content as essentially a guide to direct people on how to communicate with you, how to interact with you. I learned a really cool trick on LinkedIn. I love doing voice messages or video messages. And what I learned is that the way that people respond to those is basically kind of telling me how they like to be communicated with. So it's like if I do a voice message and somebody responds with like text or a video, that's kind of like a way of letting me know, okay, this person prefers just text or video. And that's one of the things that I love about LinkedIn is that it's so versatile in the sense that you can do a multitude of things. Like right now, you're live streaming, you can do short form video, you have this long form video option. If you want to write articles or text or, post pictures, you can do all those different things. And those are some of the things that I feel are ways that people could more effectively use LinkedIn. But also, if anybody in that, and it doesn't even have to be in that 50 plus age demographic, but if you're somebody who's tuning in wherever, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, any of the platforms, if you think that LinkedIn is primarily about, job search and a resume and hiring people and all these different things, the platform is evolving so much, and the opportunity that is there is massively insane. So that's kind of what I would say about, you know, kind of helping people like get started, giving them a sense of direction on how to essentially start building their presence on LinkedIn.
Okay, I was taking some notes, and you said there were five questions. I distinguished three,
Yep.
so maybe you combined some of the answers in those
Yep.
three. But what I wrote down was, who are you, right? Maybe from the various aspects of oneself that one would communicate, spiritual, intellectually, perhaps even emotionally,
Yep.
and then who one wants to serve, and describing that as a particular niche of people that perhaps, as in your case, 50 and above. And then you mentioned personalizing your communication and building relationships, and suggesting that one way that you can distinguish that you are personalizing is looking at how people communicate with you, and then communicating with them in the same format, whether that be text or video or some other form. So that was three for me. So I was curious about the other two questions one should ask.
Yeah, so I'll just do all five in case anybody, they can just have it all in one spot. So the first question is, who are you? Right, and that's where you're probably going to dive into your kind of core values and what's important to you, and kind of teaching people more about the person behind the profile. The second question is, who do you serve? Right, just letting people know so they can sort really quickly, like, okay, he's talking to me. The third question is, what problems do you solve, and just letting people know from the get-go, like, hey, if you're having this challenge, like, these are the problems that I solve, or solutions, or however you want to phrase it. And then the final two questions are, number one, why are you on LinkedIn? So to your point of kind of your interpretation of the question, the reason why that is because the reason why I'm on LinkedIn is to have powerful conversations and build meaningful relationships, right? So really defining why you're on LinkedIn, because realistically you could do a lot of this work like on any platform, right? But why specifically are you on LinkedIn? And then the fifth and final question is, how can other people support you, right? Because the the huge mistake that I feel like a lot of people make is as soon as they find out that somebody isn't going to be a client, they kind of just drop them, when really you don't know who people know or who they'll become. And what's really interesting is, for me, I've never really been one of those people that are so focused on the money. Like, I got into the work that I do now because it's been really fulfilling for me. And I've learned that there's things that are more important than money. And what I mean by that is, there's been a lot of opportunities that I've generated just because of how I've treated people, and they were just like, you know, I wasn't in a position to work with you, or it wasn't the right time, or all these different things, but you still treated me like I was a person. And in terms of how people navigate LinkedIn, I think it's so important to look at your network and really value each connection as a human versus just looking at them like they were another number. The the funny part that you were kind of talking about earlier is that my approach and the way that I do things are completely different from, the things that a lot of other people who have the big networks and the huge followings will tell you. And the reason is because I and I was actually thinking about this, like, because I value my network and I built it so intentionally. For me, the more my network grows, the harder it becomes to keep up with everything. And this was actually a huge challenge for me last year, because I was just like, wow, as I've grown, the way that I navigate LinkedIn has changed so much, where it's like, in the beginning, when you have all the time in the world, you can do the coffee chats, you can comment, like, a ton, and all these different things. And now that I can't do that, I I learned that that's why it's so important to build relationships, because people understand that you're not always going to be able to keep up with all their content and all these different things. And that's what I would say, is that building relationships makes being here more fun and fulfilling for me, because there's been so many people that I've gotten to impact and influence, and what's so funny to me is that when I look at the data, it's like 25 to 35 is supposedly the highest demographic usage of LinkedIn. Yet, after hosting over 1,000 audio events and attending thousands of audio events and live shows, I've maybe met like less than probably, like, I can count on two hands how many people I've met in that demographic. So that's been a huge thing for me, is that there's really been so much opportunity, because there's really been nobody else in my lane, I guess, if you say it. And the way that this relates to you, Michael, or why I said the the older that people are, the more of an advantage that social media actually is because if there's nobody else like posting on anything, then you have no competition, because you get to be the only, right? You get to dominate the space, and that's that's where the whole unique part comes in. And why, for me, I'm not teaching people how to be like me, or you know I think everybody is unique, and the strategies and the type of content that I create, more likely than not, are probably going to be completely different from the type of stuff that you like to do. And where strategy becomes an incredible tool is that I always like to say it's about creating your own rules, right? And figuring out like what strategy and what system works for you in your life and what you want to achieve, right? And that's why the direction piece and the what becomes so important, because winning on LinkedIn for one person is going to be completely different from another one. Yet so many people are trying to copy someone else's blueprint when the direction and the goals that they are trying to achieve are two completely different things. And I would say that that's the huge part of the work that I do, is really diving into that clarity part. And yeah, that's kind of what I would say.
I'm pleased to hear a fresh perspective on how to use this technology because many times, as you said, first off, we're overwhelmed with so many messages, and secondly, it's a very communication is a very cluttered space. Let me put it that way. So, and if we're listening for messages that appeal to us and our particular situation, our particular problem, then we probably want to have someone who's fully aligned and fully in tuned to who we actually are, right? And more importantly, as you said, in tune to who they actually are, so that what we're getting from them is probably at the deepest level possible in terms of utility to us rather than a quick fix, right? Or something that people are selling to us because, oh, well, you need to change your brand or you need to change the colors on your site or something like that, right? As opposed to what is it that you're actually trying to accomplish by being here with me in this moment, right? And how is it that I can serve you in accomplishing that? And then we'll have a conversation about it. The other thing that I found really helpful in this conversation with you, Paul, is the idea that we're building relationships. We're not selling something. I mean, maybe there's something, there will be some transaction that takes place at some place during the conversation or maybe even after, right? But we're building a relationship with another human being. I think that we say that sometimes, but I don't know if we really mean it. I don't know if we really are willing to take the time, right, to get to know someone else or even get to know ourselves beyond our plans, if you would, our schemes for generating income. So this is really refreshing, very refreshing. um, I'm going to ask you to answer maybe one or two more questions while we're together, and I'm going to go back to what you spoke about as the questions one should ask oneself when one is going to use this platform, and that is how um, if one succeeds in getting very clear about what one is up to, whether it's building community or whether it's helping people who are less fortunate, or whether it is actually, the whole reason I'm here is to make a buck, right? Once you get really clear about that, how is it that the algorithms that LinkedIn uses support you in connecting with the people that are like minded, that are in your lane, as you put it?
Yeah, great question. So this is kind of more of where like the technical aspect comes in, and I saw something in the comments where it says, I think it's Circle Back to You podcast, where it says the algorithm on LinkedIn is always changing and can be frustrating if you focus on it. I talked about this idea earlier of it's so important to create your own rules, because a lot of the games aren't built for people to win. Yet, in order to do that, you have to know what are the rules first. So it's like, to really answer your question, I look at LinkedIn more as a massive search engine than I do a social media platform. And the reason why the clarity aspect on your profile is so important is because the way that you design it, from all the words in your headline through everything that you add in the about section, it's all searchable. So when you're putting like the people that you're serving, or what it is that you do, or all these different things that are highly searchable things, you're gaining visibility because you're giving yourself more visibility due to the fact that you've gotten very clear on who you serve, what problems you solve, why you're on LinkedIn. There's over 1 billion users on LinkedIn, right? So you have no idea who's going to come across your profile. And like for you, Michael, you're internationally, right? Like you're in Colombia. So you can essentially help anybody all over the world. When I was in my finance career, and this is one of the reasons why I left as well, LinkedIn has a huge international presence, and there's a lot of like rules and regulations in the finance space where a lot of times like I would get people that were reaching out to me and I couldn't really do anything about it, right? Because I couldn't do business and all these different things there. There are a whole bunch of reasons why, but that's one of the things that I would say. The other thing that I would say is that people don't realize, and this is like a small little tip that I'll share with people, the way that you actually grow your network and your following and all these different things on LinkedIn isn't through creating content as much as it is commenting. Because the unique thing about LinkedIn is that commenting is a mutually beneficial feature, in the sense that not only when you comment on somebody else's post do you introduce yourself to that person's network, but when you comment, you introduce that person to your network. So, a big part, I'd say a lot of the work that I do on LinkedIn, and I always like to say it's been the biggest blessing for me, is I love connecting people on LinkedIn, right? If I can't help somebody, I probably know somebody who can. And I just love being able to do that. And that's why I would say it's so important, because it's through commenting where you get introduced to new people. You get to learn different perspectives and ideas from people that you probably wouldn't come across otherwise. And then from a technical standpoint as well, when you comment, people see like the first 100 characters of your headline. So going back to this idea of everything begins and ends with your profile on LinkedIn, when you optimize your profile and you get clear on those 5 questions, when you start creating content, you're going to draw people to your profile, right? And if you're commenting on the people that you're trying to serve, or maybe it's somebody that, you know, is big in that space and they have like a huge audience, but they don't have the expertise, and you're able to leverage your experience and expertise. If you have your profile on LinkedIn optimized, it's going to be really clear and simple for them to see that kind of correlation, being like, oh, okay, this person knows I have a show and they do this. And it's like, this is a huge problem or a huge challenge that my audience has, right? And I love bringing people to introduce them and to solve things. So that's why the technical aspect on LinkedIn is important. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did indeed. Paul, thank you so much for giving us a fresh take on a popular social media platform, or at least historically, LinkedIn, that distinguishes itself by catering to a demographic that usually has money in its pocket, right? And at the same time, being able to use that platform in ways that we haven't been using it before, that can be much more effective at gathering to our tribe, the kind of people that we want to do business with and we want to be associated with.
Mhm.
I thank you very much for this engaging conversation about thinking about LinkedIn as a search engine. That's a fresh approach for I think for many of us. So again, I've been talking to Paul Deitch. He's a LinkedIn strategist with a large following, 5,000 plus. He's available. Where can people find you, Paul?
Oh yeah. Number one, I want to say thank you so much, Michael, for the opportunity. And Jason, it was great seeing you again. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, and would love to just have a conversation. If there's any questions that anybody has, I'm happy to help. My word for 2025 is unconditional. And I always like to tell people that, my help isn't conditional on whether you can pay me. If you just have a question or something that I can answer or point you in the right direction, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you again. You've been listening to or watching The Alchemy of Success, where we give you tools for achieving whatever it is you want in life. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you for watching the Alchemy of Success podcast. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you next week.